You're ready to go.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Good morning. Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everybody who's joined this webinar. So Jason and I will be going through the Service Level Management Jakarta feature overview for today. If we go to the next slide. We have a couple of house items before we start. But let's have an overview of what is Service Level Management. I think
Lubert, go ahead and go through your house items first, please.
Yeah, I think you have there were a couple slides explaining how you can ask us questions. So for today, we have Jason Accolini, who's the product manager for Service Level Management. Myself, I'm Lubert. I'll be the moderator for this conversation, and if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A session, and I will make sure that we answer them, and we have a Q&A session at the end. So for today, I think I'm just going to kick it off for Jason to explain to you what Service Level Management and the Jakarta features are.
Well, good morning. My name is Jason Accolini. I am the product manager for Service Level Management, as well as Change Management, which both are owned by the ITSM BU here at ServiceNow. This morning, I was going to run through the new features that we added to the Service Level Management feature. But prior to doing that, I was going to give a little background on the process itself and ServiceNow's Service Level Management application in general. So I've heard this phrase a number of times over the last 18 months or so that ITIL is dead. And if you are someone who believes that, you're probably not going to like my first couple of slides, because I am a firm believer and firm proponent of that framework. And I think that the processes that are described within it still have a ton of relevance, not only in the space of IT service fulfillment, but also in the other service domains in which we operate, whether those be HR or facilities. So how does ITIL describe service level management? ITIL describes it as the process responsible for agreeing and documenting service level targets and responsibilities within SLAs and service level requirements for every service and related activity within IT. And of course, ITIL is very IT focused. Anytime I see that reference to IT, I view it as a representative example, and I think that it's every bit applicable to services that other providers within the enterprise provide, such as our HR teams or our facility teams as we have requests for them. The purpose of this process is to ensure that all current and planned IT services are delivered to agreed achievable targets. And agreed and achievable are two critical words in that definition, in the sense that a service level agreement is never something that is or should be solely dictated by one party within that service picture, whether it is the business entity being served or the provider that's serving it. It's a negotiated agreement to ensure that what is being negotiated is not only achievable, but measurable. This goal and purpose of this process is accomplished through a constant cycle of negotiating, agreeing, monitoring, reporting, and reviewing IT service targets and achievements. What are some of the objectives? We've already talked about the purpose being to define, document, agree, monitor, measure. Not going to spend a lot of time there. Skipping straight forward to the second bullet, I think this is a key aspect of service level management that's often overlooked or forgotten about. And the objective of improving the relationship and communication between the business, its customers, and those that are providing service to those customers. We need to ensure that service targets are specific in nature, that they're measurable. And even when we are achieving those targets that have been set and agreed to, that we're constantly looking for ways to improve upon the service that we offer and the quality of service that we deliver. Why do we do it? What value does it provide to the users we serve? What value does it provide to the business in general? It's a consistent interface for any service-related issue. It provides those agreed service target and required management information to ensure those targets are met. When targets are breached, service level management provides that feedback that something has been breached and hopefully details to prevent similar breaches in the future. And ultimately, it's really providing a reliable channel of communication and hopefully establishing trust in the relationship between provider and customer. So switching gears, let's talk a little bit about ServiceNow's service level management solution. This application has been in the platform for a long period of time. It's a very task-focused or task-based solution in that it enables you to document, track, and manage SLAs, OLAs, or underpinning contracts against any task type in the system. And the word task, I've said it like 5 times in that couple of sentences. That's not by accident. You can create service level agreements, OLAs, underpinning contracts against any task type, any extension of task, but you do not have the ability to define SLAs against objects which do not extend the task table. The most prominent examples we provide demo data for out of the box, such as incident. Service request is another area where service level agreements are commonly defined, but they can also be defined against other task types such as problems and change requests and those sort of service requests from HR and some of our other providers. Our service level management solution makes providers always aware when an SLA exists, what the expected duration or target of that SLA is. We do this by generating records which are called task SLAs that we'll talk about in a minute, but those task SLAs are physically attached to a fulfillment task, such as an incident. And as the service desk or our level 2 or level 3 support personnel work a task, they always have the ability to reference that task SLA record and understand what SLA definition does this relate to, what duration or percentage of the SLA has been consumed, and how much available time is remaining to fulfill this task within the agreed service duration that has been defined. We generate notifications and escalations at predetermined durations. So out of the box, we will notify the assignee of a particular task that an SLA has reached 50% of its total duration. At 75%, we'll bring their manager into the picture and make sure that they're aware that this SLA has reached 75% of the total duration. And we do that by using the platform's workflow capability. We provide the ability to monitor, report, and understand service performance about agreed service level targets. This can occur via standard reporting using more advanced analytics via performance analytics. And we'll talk about a tool that we added in the Jakarta release called the SLA timeline that enables you to really dig into the understanding of how SLAs evolve throughout the life cycle of an individual task. And then we've got an auxiliary component called SLA contracts that enables us to easily associate one or more SLA definitions with a contract that perhaps we have with an external vendor who provides service for us. What are some of the key components of service level management? We have a premise called the SLA engine, which is the underlying processing engine, which initiates, tracks, and updates all active task SLA records. A task SLA is that record that attaches to a fulfillment task, which tracks the performance for that SLA, the duration, our adherence to the targets and agreement that's been made. And over on the right, you can see an example of a list of task SLA records. This list is associated with a single task, incident number 60, and we can see there was a number of SLAs that attached to it. And just using that list, we're easily able to see what type of SLA it was, what the target of service was, what stage that SLA was at, what sort of time remained, whether it be business time or actual time. The difference between the two, business time would account for any schedule associated with an SLA. And when that SLA started and stopped. And there's also additional fields that can be added to this list, including the amount of total duration. An SLA definition is really one of the key components of service level management, in the sense that this is where we document those agreements that have been made. It enables us to define a number of attributes within that agreement, the type, what table it'll apply to, what workflow will be used to generate notifications and escalations. And we do have a new workflow in the Jakarta release that we'll talk about in a moment. We're able to define what type of duration this SLA will have. Is it a fixed duration? Is it relative to a point in time, such as a due date on a catalog task? We can define whether or not this SLA has a schedule associated with it. In the example that I've included on this slide, it's for response to a priority 1 incident. So these would be the sort of incidents that we'd work on a 7/24 basis until the incident was resolved. But lower priority incidents or tasks may have a schedule associated with them, defining that the SLA only accumulates duration during business hours. We may exclude holidays from those schedules. And then we're also able to define what time zone the schedule or SLA is applicable to. At the bottom of an SLA definition, we're able to define or document the conditions which determine the various SLA stage changes. So what conditions within a particular record would trigger the start of this SLA? What conditions would cause this SLA to pause? Perhaps we put the incident on hold and set the on hold reason to awaiting customer. Perhaps we set the incident to resolve because we believe that we've resolved that level of service or request from a customer. What conditions would force this SLA to be considered complete? Has this incident been closed and the task is no longer active? And then what conditions may force this SLA to reset? Perhaps a classic example of that would be the assignment group has changed. Shifting gears to what's new in Jakarta, we added 5 specific features within the Jakarta timeframe. The first that we'll talk about are some new roles to manage service level management. We added a field to the SLA definition form called target that we've already seen a glimpse of. We enhanced our demo data, which we'll talk about, added a new notification and escalation workflow, and built this nice visualization that you can see over to the right called the SLA timeline that really provides us a great deal of understanding and detail relative to an SLA. So first, the roles. A lot of people don't recognize that prior to the Jakarta release, to do something as simple as document a new SLA definition or to update an SLA definition, you actually required the admin role. It's kind of interesting that you required the keys to the castle to do something that's a relatively common function, but to address that and to give organizations the opportunity to farm this work out from a central administrative team to business-specific teams, we've introduced two roles, one called SLA admin, one called SLA manager. And I've created a little table over to the right, which enables you to see the difference in access controls that those two roles possess. SLA admin has full administrative rights to the service level management application, including the ability to view SLA repair logs, execute SLA repair, define service level management properties, including those that control the SLA engine, and obviously define SLA definitions. The SLA manager role possesses a subset of those overall rights, but has the ability to view the SLA homepage, to define SLA definitions, and view SLA repair logs, but not actually execute or initiate SLA repair. We enhanced the demo data that comes in service level management in the Jakarta release, and some may be asking, why is demo data a feature that we're even talking about? A lot of customers that are just getting started in service level management will use our out-of-the-box SLA definition as a basis on which to start and expand their tracking, monitoring, and negotiating of service level agreements. Historically, we've always had a handful of resolution target service level agreement definitions defined for each of the priorities against the incident table. Those SLA definitions have been modified in a couple of ways. First and foremost, the duration on them has been made more aggressive and aligned with the sort of durations that our higher performing customers were defining within their enterprises. We've also modified some of the conditions, specifically around pause and stop conditions. Previously, an SLA would stop when an SLA would go into a resolved state. We now only stop the SLA when it's closed and the task becomes active. We updated the pause conditions to include the scenario where we're awaiting information for the customer that we're working with, but also to include when an SLA goes to resolved. We did this so if our customer came back to us before the incident was closed and said this issue actually isn't resolved, rather than generating new SLAs, we would just restart the SLA that had already attached to that particular incident. We've also included new response SLA definitions to complement those resolution definitions. So the response SLAs would dictate the period of time between the incident being logged and us as a provider acknowledging the existence of that incident. And using priority 1 as an example, we've defined the resolution target for that priority 1 SLA definition at an hour. The response SLA definition has been defined to acknowledge that we should accept that issue and start working on it in 15 minutes or less. We added a pretty simple field. Yes, Lubert.
Quick question on that. What is recommended to use as a stop condition? So if you have a task that can be resolved and closed, but you can move the status directly to closed.
You know, it's funny because I spoke at a ServiceNow users group yesterday and had a similar question. And the question from the customer was, we allow our service desk users to move an incident to closed before ever saving or submitting the record. And the challenge that they were facing was that there was never any SLA associated with that task. And generally, I'm not a huge fan of that behavior. I far prefer that as a incident is worked, even if we resolve that incident or believe we resolved that incident in the initial contact, I would much prefer that the fulfiller only be able to move it to a resolved state, and then the customer can either accept that resolution or not respond, and incident management would automatically close that task. The way we've defined the demo data out of the box, I think, is a really sound approach. We pause the SLA when it goes to a resolved state. If an SLA moves to close and the task is inactive, we stop that. But, you know, the challenge that the customer described was that, you know, the task never really was active because we never really saved it in a new state, so it moves straight to closed, not triggering the SLAs they had defined. So I would discourage that sort of behavior for more than one reason, and the primary reason is give the customer an opportunity to validate or come back and say, this really isn't fixed. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Another question, Lubert?
No, I think we'll keep the next one for later.
Thank you. We added a pretty simple field to the SLA definition form called target. It's a simple choice list. Out of the box, we've included two values, the two most primary target values, resolution and response. And we did so for our customers that have many SLA definitions. It's really just another tool to give the provider to filter that list really easily and focus on the administration or modification of the definition that they're looking for. We included a new workflow within Jakarta. For newer customers, this will be the default workflow moving forward. For existing customers, they would be able to, for existing customers that upgrade to Jakarta, they'll be able to leverage this workflow, but it will not be their default if they create a new SLA definition. Previously, the SLA notification and escalation workflow performed what's called hierarchical escalation, which I described earlier, which is as an assignee, as I'm working a task, I'll be notified that an SLA has reached a specific duration. At a certain percentage, we'll bring the manager into that communication loop, performing hierarchical escalation. Hey, manager, this SLA has reached 75% of its total duration. We're also now doing what's called functional escalation. So if you're leveraging the CMDB, as everyone should be, and you've defined who the supported by individual is for a particular CI, we'll now notify that user if they are not the assignee of the particular task and that task is of a priority 1 or priority 2, we will notify the CI supported by resource to let them know that a high priority task is opened against their CI, perhaps engaging them in the resolution of that issue. And by notifying someone who is responsible for the support of that particular service or CI, we're performing what ITIL would describe as functional escalation.
Quick question on the workflow.
Yeah.
So if any of the tasks are on hold, that's affecting and impacting the SLA status. So is there a way that the escalation workflow can help with that?
Well, so a SLA, I would argue, an SLA definition, if it's on hold, and the on hold reason is that we're awaiting the customer, should be in a pause state. If it is on hold because of some reason, from a provider or fulfillment perspective, the duration of that SLA is going to continue to accumulate, and the same sort of notifications are going to be triggered. But if the on-hold reason is something on the provider's end, the clock continues to tick against that provider, and they're held to the same standard that they'd be held to if the incident was a work in progress.
Thank you.
Makes sense? All right, so the SLA timeline. This was really the major investment that we had within the Jakarta release, and it is a new visualization that empowers anyone involved in a fulfillment task, as well as SLA managers, business relationship managers, with full access to all SLAs that attach to a related task in a visual fashion. It provides a great deal of understanding of how that SLA evolved throughout the life cycle of the related task. And a great example of that is all of the various colors that we see related to a particular SLA. Looking at task SLA 1, which is the first row listed, I can easily see that this task breached by seeing this red color, and I can easily understand the events that triggered that SLA, the duration of time it remained open, and the fact that it evolved through 0 to 50%, that green color, 50 to 75% of its overall duration, which is this yellow color, 75 to 100% of its total duration, which is this orange color, and ultimately it breached and remained in breached for more than an hour beyond the agreed resolution duration. We're able to understand the significant task-related events that led to a state or stage change. So everywhere where you see a triangle, that indicates an event update on the task that SLA is related to. What I describe as significant events, those events which led to an SLA stage change, will be filled in black. We also have the ability to display what are called insignificant task updates. And by insignificant, those task updates are updates to the task that did not trigger a stage change. And in a slide or two, we'll describe that, but why that might be helpful or useful to you. Moving to the question, Lubert.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I received earlier was, what were the motivations behind building this timeline?
Good question. So first and foremost, the SLA timeline isn't new in Jakarta. It's completely revamped. So there was an old timeline prior to the Jakarta release, which really did not present very well. It was a very dated UI. The information that it attempted to convey was not easily understood and easily consumed. So that was really the initial motivation. We had a tool that existed that wasn't really serving the purpose and the needs of our customers. The second really driving force there was customers often struggle with SLA definitions and the initial creation of them. Also, the troubleshooting of those SLA definitions. I've created this SLA definition. It's not triggering a particular stage change as I'm expected, and I'm having a hard time figuring out why. The SLA timeline should really help users understand the various conditions they've defined and the sort of task updates that are going to trigger those various SLA stage changes. So I've got a couple of screenshots on this slide, which kind of shows some of the capabilities within this new UI. We've got some powerful filtering capabilities that enables you to filter in a Boolean fashion based on SLA stage, based on an SLA definition, and a single toggle that would easily enable you to just focus on any SLA which is breached. We have a number of different pieces of information that help in your understanding of a particular event within this timeline. So I can hover over things like those triangles and get a summary a bit of information. If I select any event, whether it's a triangle or a portion of that SLA span, in this case, the duration between 75 and 100% of this SLA, I'll get a summary bit of information of when that, what the progress of that stage is. When did it start? Is it in a breach state? And then if I select any event within this interface, I get detail in the bottom pane that is in context to the event that I've selected. So switching to this bottom screenshot, I've selected this little gray bar that is displaying within the green span. And this gray bar is indicative of out of schedule time. And the detail that I see relative to that out of schedule time is specific to it. When did the out of schedule time start? When did it end? And what was the duration of that out of schedule time? How much total out of schedule time has elapsed in the life of this task? So if this task had lasted or spanned more than one day, that total duration may be different than the duration of this single span. There's a lot of different visual treatments within this UI. These lighter shades indicate a retroactive time. So we've included a nice legend that makes the learning curve of what all these things mean really quick and easy, and will always be available to you. There are zooming capabilities, and the zoom is really, really simple. It's a plus and minus control like most people will be acclimated to if they've ever used Google Maps on a computer. And I believe we have 9 levels of zoom available out of the box. Needless to say, pretty powerful UI, pretty easy to use UI, and for those familiar with the existing SLA timeline, I'm pretty confident they're going to like this new one a little better. I mentioned the ability to display insignificant task updates. So underneath the configuration action in the upper right of the header, I've got the ability to show all task updates. All task updates display without any fill. It's a white triangle. And where this really is useful is in that troubleshooting scenario that I described. I expected an SLA stage change to occur, and for some reason it did not. I can look at every update that occurred to the task and get detail in the detail pane in context to that event, showing me what the update was and what the conditions that are defined within the SLA definition are for that particular stage change. So it's a really powerful tool to enable me to troubleshoot an SLA definition that I believe may not be behaving as expected. And then again, at the bottom of this UI, you can see different details. In this case, I've selected an SLA stage change, so the detail is specific to that stage. I get a summary bit of information as well as stage start and stage end details. So that's what I have for slides. Let's jump into an instance really quickly and take a look at some of these features, and we will leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. All righty. Hopefully you can see my browser, Lubert.
Yes.
All right, let's start with the roles, and we'll just do this really quickly. I have a couple of different roles. If I go to the SLA admin role, note that I have rights. We've embedded the ITIL role rights within the SLA admin role. If I go to service level management, we can see I've got that full access and control to the application, including access to the property screens, and the ability to initiate SLA repair. If I impersonate our SLA manager role, we can see he also possesses the ITIL role, but from a service level management perspective has a subset of those SLA admin rights that we had previously seen. I'm just going to focus on, let's just go ahead and focus on our resolution SLAs. As I mentioned, we had updated and enhanced this demo data. The primary components of that enhancement were the durations, the durations associated with that particular SLA and the conditions defined within pause conditions. Note, as we always have, we'll pause our default SLA definitions when an incident goes on hold and it is awaiting callers. But we'll also now pause when the incident state goes to resolved for the exact reason I described earlier. If we look at our response SLAs, and we'll just pick on priority 1 again, we've agreed to respond to priority 1 incidents in 15 minutes or less, and essentially work those issues until resolution, and not stop those particular SLAs until we've acknowledged this issue by updating the state from new to something other than new and assigning this issue to someone to be fulfilled. If we look at our resolution definitions, we can see I've associated, or I have this new workflow associated. Let's go ahead and take a peek. Oh, well, there's a problem. Let's go in there as admin so I actually have rights to look at that workflow. So if I show that new workflow, we can see that we now notify the assignee's manager earlier in the life cycle of the task. Prior to Jakarta, we only brought the manager into the escalation picture once the SLA breached. I felt that was a little too late. You can also see that we notify the CI supported by at 50% of the total duration, but so we don't pepper those CI supported bys for every low priority issue. We've limited that to tasks where the priority is either 1 or 2. And finally, well, I'm sorry, let's go back and look at our SLA definitions. I forgot to talk about the target field. We've exposed that within the list view, and it's really easy for me to just focus on resolution targets, response targets, and as a choice list. If customers have other target types that they've defined within service level management, they can augment that choice list as needed. Finally, let's go look at our SLA timeline. How am I doing on time here, Ludwig?
Looks good. I might have a couple of questions after the demo.
All righty. All right, so SLA timeline. Any task which has an SLA attached to it, and we can see on this incident number 60, I have a number of tasks. Any task that has an SLA associated with it will show this SLA timeline UI action. If I initiate the timeline from the task itself, by default, it's going to show me all SLAs that are associated with that particular task. So in this case, incident 60 had a number of different SLA definitions associated with it. We display all of those. Had I drilled into a particular task SLA record and initiated the SLA timeline, which I had the ability to do, the timeline would have by default displayed with only the information relative to that SLA itself. In either case, I always have the ability to change my filter criteria to show any SLA associated with this particular task. But there's a couple of different ways that you can launch this timeline, and based on that way that you launch it, will determine what the default display includes. You also have the ability to launch the SLA timeline from any list of task SLA records, whether you're looking at a related list or or you go straight to the task SLA table itself. I mentioned our zoom controls, very easy to use, plus, minus, allow me to zoom in, zoom out, and a number of different levels of detail are available. If at any point in time I want to focus on a particular SLA, I've got this neat little reticle for people that have ever looked through a gun scope. They would see something that looks similar like this. It enables me to focus on the beginning of that particular task. I mentioned the ability to kind of hover over different pieces of an SLA and get different summary information. I also have the ability to click on any of these different events and get different detail. In this case, I'm selecting this event, which is a significant task update. It is a task update which caused a stage change. And I can look and see that the SLA condition that was triggered was the start condition. I always know what condition was triggered based on this little blue checkbox. And then I'm easily able to understand why this SLA triggered. The SLA condition, start condition, was specific to the assignment group equaling the network group. And we can see that the task update, the assignment group was updated to the network group. We'll also display additional task updates that occurred at that time. And at that time, it was assigned to a user named David Liu. The urgency was set to 2. There were some work notes added, some additional comments added. But at any point in time, I'm able to look at various events within an SLA and understand how that SLA evolved throughout the life cycle of the task. I mentioned our legend. That's available under this little action. Again, it explains every various UI treatment that's in here. So a colored or filled in diamond tells me that an SLA is completed. In this case, we have a white diamond or an unfilled diamond indicating that the SLA was canceled for some reason or another. We have task updates which included stage changes, little bars that will display that give you the estimated breach time, and then again, you know, the various durations. Green for below 50%, yellow between 50 and 75, orange between 75 and 100, and anything that's breached displays as red. It is no accident that we chose those colors. Those colors are actually an established paradigm. So if you look at a list of task SLA records, depending on where that SLA is in its life cycle, some of the fields are colored in, and the colors that are used align with the same colors that we use here within the SLA timeline. And I think that's going to wrap our demonstration this morning. Lubert, do we have any questions? Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I think if we go back to one of the schedules in the instance where you were just showing for the demo, and there were a couple of questions on the schedule where there's the time zone source. And how that relates to the timeline?
Sure.
So understanding when the SLA actually starts and when you assign that particular to the time zone from the source to caller, basically.
So the SLA timeline itself will display any SLA, and a schedule is associated with an SLA definition. Let's pick on priority 2 resolution. So priority 2 issues, we have an 8-hour duration. We have a schedule associated with them indicating that we'll only work on those during business hours. And then anytime a schedule is associated with an SLA definition, we've got the ability to define what time zone will be the source for that SLA, and a number of different values available to us. Perhaps it's the caller's time zone, the SLA definitions time zone, the CI locations time zone, the task location time zone, or the caller's location time zone. Within the SLA timeline detail pane, you certainly have access to that information, and an SLA is going to present based on the time zone it's defined in. There is no ability within that UI today to change the overarching time zone for the UI. It's all driven based on the SLA itself.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I've not received any questions via the Q&A section, so I ask all attendees to be sure that if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them.
Oops. We'll give another moment for questions to come in.
Cool. I think this has concluded the presentation for today. I will stay on the line, and Jason as well, for a couple more minutes for anybody who is still typing a question. I already see a couple of attendees dropping off. So for those still on the line, thank you very much for attending. And as said earlier, we'll be on the line for a couple more minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lubert. Thank you, Anne. And thank you, everyone, for attending.